Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV, Alternative Media Television. It is Wednesday, July 30th, 2014, and it sure doesn't feel like a 4% economy. This according to a CEO, with the latest bullshit GDP numbers that came out today saying that the economy grew at 4%. Now, of course, we know this is all bullshit because just like the first time, just like the last time in the first quarter, they said we had growth, and then the numbers were revised downward to negative 2.9% contraction. So there was negative growth. They always come out with positive growth, and then they show us in future reports when nobody's looking that we actually had negative growth. And now we have a report today saying that the economy grew at 4%. But I want you to keep in mind, this is just the initial report. Again, last time they said the economy grew at a 1% clip, I believe, somewhere in that ballpark, but it actually contracted negative 2.9%. That's a almost 4% discrepancy in the original print. All of this bullshit and all of this lies. Strong second quarter growth sparks rate hike talk. Well, here's a good question, folks. If things are so great, if things are so amazing, if we're getting 4% growth, why is the Federal Reserve still easing? Why are they still stimulating the dirty ass hooker that makes up Wall Street today? Well, that answers your question. The question is, we're not growing. The economy's actually contracting. Things are actually worse. Unemployment is bad. And there is inflation already built into the program, but people can't see it. In fact, Ron Paul was talking about this yesterday, of which I'll get to in a moment. It says a stunning acceleration in second quarter growth and a jump in inflation triggered a new round of speculation that the Fed will have to speed up plans to hike rates. And I always find this funny because for 6 years now, there's basically been the same narrative. Wall Street sells the market short anytime they think the Fed might raise rates, and then the Fed, because they're scared of pissing off the hedge funds, doesn't raise rates. And so we've been at this Ponzi scheme for 6 years now, and it's created massive inflation and a massive wealth transfer from the middle class poor and to the rich. You know, maybe Occupy Wall Street had something right. Don't agree with a lot of the socialist policies and the socialist framework of what made up Occupy Wall Street, but they do understand the criminal nature of these thugs in Wall Street today, especially at the Federal Reserve. And it's one of the fundamental reasons why the Federal Reserve needs to get out of the money printing business. They need to remove themselves from the situation as fast as possible with their dual mandate now really becoming a triple mandate of manipulating and financial gang-banging our markets. Janet Yellen, the whore that she is at the Federal Reserve, actually telling insiders when she thinks the market is properly valued, overvalued, or undervalued. The Fed actually telling the free market what they think. Shouldn't we just let the free market do what it's supposed to do, like it did in 2008 with a giant crash, and let ourselves work through the situation at hand instead of stimulating even larger, bigger, more aggressive and deadly asset bubbles like we have today that could potentially be the end of the world, and that's not an exaggeration. These debt bubbles that we have, in fact, the debt is the only thing that's been growing in America, folks. That's the only thing that's been moving in a positive direction. More and more debt. And this is financial war, I would argue, intentional financial war to bankrupt America. And it's only proven that the September 11th terrorist attacks, whether or not they were caused and perpetrated by a rogue terrorist group like Al-Qaeda or it was an inside job by our own government, was largely successful because it's bankrupted our nation, created even larger asset bubbles. The Federal Reserve has responded with even lower and lower interest rates, now going on 6 years now, and they did the same thing in the build-up to the collapse of 2008. And now the debt loads are even bigger. And again, with faster-paced growth, why aren't they raising rates? Shouldn't we be fearing inflation? And yes, inflation is already built into this equation. In fact, we already have it. And I would argue that inflation is already in asset bubbles like stocks, like bonds, like the mortgage market today. All of this a part of inflation, if not hyperinflation in the not too distant future. We see this with food prices, meat, poultry, milk, all kinds of goods that you buy at the grocery store. Very difficult to argue that prices aren't heavily inflated. I don't just think so. Many others think so. People like Ron Paul think so. Say that stocks are in a bubble and will crash. Remember, Ron Paul was correct. Ron Paul was correct in his original assessment of the 2008 financial bubble and crash. The former U.S. representative from Texas and perhaps America's most popular libertarian voice has long said that the nation's monetary and fiscal policies would result in a massive inflation. According to the common measures of inflation, this has not yet occurred. But Paul, as do I, maintains that the inflation he has warned of has indeed come to fruition in asset prices, and that once it unravels, a market crash will ensue. Quote, I think there's plenty of inflation, but my definition of inflation is a little different than the rest, because I think prices going up in different areas is a consequence of inflation, Paul said on Tuesday's Futures Now. There's a lot of inflation in the stock market, and I think there's a bubble there. And I think there's a bubble in a lot more places in the stock market today, and of course it will crash, and of course it will detonate like a nuke and potentially bring down the dollar for good. And that is the reality of what we live today, and all of it we can thank the Federal Reserve, we can thank Janet Yellen, we can thank Ben Bernanke, we can thank President Barack Obama, we can thank Republicans and Democrats for burning Rome to the ground. You know, while we're supposedly, allegedly, we know it's not true, we know it's bullshit, we know there'll be a revision downwards, we know there'll be a reprint. Argentina, reminiscent of the 2001 debt bubble collapse that made up technology stocks here in the United States, and one of the precursors to that was a default of Argentina in 2001, Buenos Aires, is now in debt talks once again. Yeah, that's right. We're repeating history. People don't know their history, though. Argentina debt talks go down to avert an imminent default. And of course, the hedge funds want their money back. A lot of these hedge funds covert, made up of the CIA, hedge funds like InQtel, INQTEL, invest in things like many have speculated for some time, like Bitcoin. It's absolutely ridiculous that these hedge funds have this much power, that they're able to operate covertly and literally blow up the world using their leverage. I mean, the notional value of derivatives in the derivative market, and it's difficult to understand these insurance contracts that supposedly, allegedly protect institutions from default, is a massive, massive market. I mean, some of the estimates I've seen say that it's 10 times, 12 times global GDP, the notional value of derivatives. That's how big these potential markets are. And that's why when I say that a default, and it's not just a potential default, you'll get a guaranteed default here in the United States of America. We have our own default problems. People look at Argentina and they think they have problems. The United States debt to GDP ratio and our problems are just as worse, if not arguably more bad than what we're seeing overseas. And all of this will come to roost, and it's exactly why these markets and these asset bubbles will implode precisely at the same time. And we have to worry about inflation. As millions of students do, or former students that were actually lied to and bought into the paradigm hook, line, and sinker that taking on records amount of student loan debt was actually going to get them a job and pay off. Well, we know that's a lie. With the student loan market and the debt market and student loans hitting a record high of $1.2 trillion. Students coming out of school and college thinking they're going to get jobs, finally stepping out into the real world with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. And it's crippling our economy, which is exactly why the U.S. Treasury is saying, hey, we might just forgive it now. Yeah, that's how much of a bullshit fest our system is. The U.S. Treasury Department and the government and these entities like Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac, they engineer, create, and then sell this debt to the American people, make trillions, and then after crippling the economy say, we'll just get rid of it. It's like 2008. Well, you just short sale. Just go bankrupt. No big deal. We'll bail out the banks. All of this, again, at record levels and record highs. This is why it is the fall from grace, and it's why America will default on its debt. Just like every nation that's ever had debt to GDP ratios at these levels will default. And it will be a bankruptcy of the United States, the dollar will collapse overnight. There will be likely hyperinflation followed by deflation, and there will be stagnant growth in the United States for years to come. It very likely could be the end of the world. And we can only imagine if there's an ancillary event, like a dirty bomb that, God forbid, implodes or explodes in an American city, or there is an EMP attack, as a money manager who manages billions of dollars warned about yesterday in a video that I posted before this one, or it's global war and escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, or it's these hedge funds covertly blowing up the world, or maybe it's just an accident. All of these real issues and real problems. Again, people forget their history. Americans forget their history, folks. Remember Paul Volcker, who was head of the Federal Reserve during the Jimmy Carter era in the 1970s? The dollar almost collapsed then. Yeah, many don't know that, but the U.S. dollar was on the verge of collapse in the 1970s, and we had aggressive inflation. And it took Paul Volcker to raise rates where you were looking at some bonds in the ballpark of 17%. Could you imagine, and can you imagine when rates suddenly spike higher here in the United States of America, and let's say rates are at 17%, driving rates on record student loan debt of $1.2 trillion in the 17% range? Could you imagine having a mortgage of 10%, 12%, 15%, 19%, 20%? Could you imagine all the Americans defaulting on their credit cards when rates rise above zero? Because that's exactly where we are today, zero. And it's exactly why I've argued for some time they can't raise rates. So all this bullshit, lying, and all this talk about, Wall Street's afraid that they're going to raise rates sooner rather than later in 2015 after 6 years of the same program and the same Ponzi scheme at zero. Of course they're not going to raise rates, not willingly. But the free market at some point is going to raise rates on their own. The market forces are going to come into play, and the U.S. is going to be the focus of a massive debt default, and this is all going to spark a lot of fear. It's going to spark the default of the dollar, and it will spark the collapse of our economy, which is already in the toilet. Again, this is just a stimulation of the financial elite, kind of getting their rocks off, the last big party before the implosion, before the rest of us get hit on the chin, or worse, potentially dig our graves and dig the grave of America as a result of these policies. Again, rates are still at zero, folks. When they rise willingly or unwillingly into the ballpark of what we had during the 1970s, at this time, when the economy is much less healthy than it was before, at a time when we have more debt than we have had in the history of the world, you can't even argue that because it's just the absolute truth. It will end the United States of America for good. And you have all these crony politicians and Wall Street gangbangers to thank for. I think so. Ron Paul thinks so. Hedge fund managers think so. Many elites and insiders on Wall Street and Washington, D.C. think so. Many around the world think so. Many of you tuning in think so. And if that isn't a self-fulfilling prophecy in and of itself, I don't know what is. It's the hardcore truth. It's the absolute truth. It's the reality of the situation, and it's all going to come to roost. I'm Christopher Green. Get it out everywhere. Make it viral, hard-hitting it in your face, and click the link below to support our sponsor.